Imagine inventing the most revolutionary technology in human history, the ability to record thoughts, pass down knowledge, and conquer time itself. You would think the first written documents were profound philosophical treatises, epic poetry, or sacred conversations with the gods, right? Wrong. One of the oldest known, beautifully preserved pieces of writing is essentially a one-star Yelp review complaining about some really bad copper. Meet Ea-nasir. Over 3,500 years ago, this Mesopotamian merchant scammed a customer, and the angry complaint was immortalized in clay. Welcome to Sumer, the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of writing, and the very first place where someone asked to speak to the manager. But how did we get here? How did humanity go from wandering hunter-gatherers to writing petty complaints in mud? To understand the Sumerian enigma, we have to travel back to around 4500 BCE, to a completely unforgiving landscape in the Middle East. Most of the world was still figuring out how to make pointy rocks. Life was harsh, short, and frankly, very boring. But tucked between the scorching deserts, a miracle was waiting. A massive, untamed water system called the Tigris and the Euphrates. This region, known as Mesopotamia, literally meaning the land between the rivers, was a rare oasis of potential in a world of dust. And someone, or rather, some very clever feline, was watching this potential closely, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Greetings, hairless apes. I am the supreme overseer of this little experiment you call civilization. While your ancestors were busy chasing gazelles, my chosen subjects, these round, surprisingly capable birds, found this fertile valley. They realized that instead of walking all day for a handful of berries, they could just throw seeds in the mud and wait. This simple realization was the spark that ignited the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Sumerian era had begun. But before they could build those massive cities, our ancient ancestors had to deal with a rather significant problem. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were not gentle bubbling brooks. They were violent, highly unpredictable aquatic monsters. Imagine spending months carefully planting your crops, only for a surprise flash flood to wash you and your house into the sea. It was incredibly frustrating. Clearly, if they were going to survive here, they couldn't just rely on hoping for good weather. The main issue was timing. In this region, the climate basically only has two modes: absolutely bone dry or completely underwater. For most of the year, the scorching sun baked the earth into a rock-hard crust where absolutely nothing could sprout. Then spring arrived. Snow melted in the northern mountains, sending massive, destructive walls of water crashing down the river valleys. A single bird with a stick couldn't stop a flood. But what about 50 birds? Or 500 of them? This environmental nightmare was the true catalyst for civilization. It forced teamwork. They had to cooperate, or they would starve. They began digging complex networks of trenches to divert the raging floodwaters away from their homes and into safe storage basins. Then, when the dry summer hit, they simply opened the gates, letting the trapped water flow gently into their thirsty fields. This system, known as irrigation, completely broke the rules of nature. They were essentially hacking the environment to their advantage. The results were absolutely staggering. Suddenly, this small patch of mud produced more wheat and barley than they could ever eat. This created something humanity had never really seen before: an agricultural surplus, a massive, reliable safety net of extra calories. And when you have a surplus of food, something magical happens in a society. Not everyone has to be a farmer anymore. With a guaranteed food supply, some birds could focus entirely on other skills. You had artisans, builders, and full-time professional complainers. The scribe could spend all day keeping track of who owned what, while the rest of the city functioned like a giant, well-oiled machine. The soldier could dedicate his life to hitting things with sharp objects, protecting this shiny new wealth from jealous neighbors. And of course, someone had to sit at the top and tell everyone else what to do. Thus, the concept of a king was born. This specialization triggered an explosion of innovation and growth. If you don't have to farm, you have a lot of free time to invent things. Things like the wheel. At first, they just used it to spin pottery, but soon realized it was pretty great for moving heavy rocks. Suddenly, trade networks expanded. You could haul massive amounts of goods across the desert without breaking your back. They also leveled up their technology tree by mixing copper and tin to create bronze, a super metal of the ancient world. Bronze tools were harder, sharper, and lasted infinitely longer than their old fragile stone tools. It was a complete game changer. All these innovations snowballed, transforming scattered mud huts into something spectacular. Uruk, humanity's first true megacity. At its peak, Uruk housed tens of thousands of residents. It was the New York City of 3000 BCE, just with more clay and less pizza. But a city of this size creates a logistical nightmare. Society became a strict pyramid, kings at the top, and a whole lot of confused farmers at the bottom. To appease the gods and show off their power, they organized massive labor forces to build towering stepped pyramids called ziggurats. But managing taxes, paying thousands of workers, and distributing millions of pounds of grain required a level of memory that the human brain just doesn't have. They needed a way to store data outside of their own heads. They were about to accidentally invent the greatest technology in history. The very first writing wasn't a complex alphabet of letters and sounds, it was basically just a collection of ancient emojis. If a scribe wanted to record a sheep for the king's tax collection, they just drew a literal picture of a sheep on wet clay. But drawing detailed fluffy sheep takes entirely too long, especially when you have a massive urban surplus of 10,000 sheep to count. So, over centuries, the pictures got simpler and faster. They evolved into abstract arrangements of wedge-shaped marks pressed into the mud. This is known as cuneiform. It was the world's first fully developed writing system, created not for epic poetry, but purely for obsessive accounting. The technology was beautifully simple. Grab a handful of river mud, shape it into a flat, comfortable tablet in your hand, and press a specially cut wooden reed stylus into the soft surface. No ink to spill, no paper to tear, and no crashing hard drives. Once baked in the scorching Mesopotamian sun, these mud spreadsheets became practically indestructible, surviving for thousands of years. Take that, modern cloud storage. But they didn't just invent writing to track their wealth. The Sumerians also completely revolutionized mathematics to manage the logistics of their sprawling megacities. While we use a base 10 system mostly because we happen to have 10 fingers, the Sumerians used a highly complex base 60 system. Why 60? Because it's a mathematically beautiful number. It can be cleanly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you've ever wondered why there are 60 seconds in a minute, or 360 degrees in a circle, you can literally thank a Sumerian accountant. Of course, mastering hundreds of abstract cuneiform symbols and advanced base 60 mathematics wasn't exactly an easy task for an average bird. It required years of brutal, tedious schooling in elite academies known as the Ejuba, which literally translates to House of Tablets. Graduating meant you were the ancient equivalent of a Silicon Valley tech billionaire. You held the literal code that ran the empire. Armed with this ultimate code, the Sumerians essentially invented big data. They started recording absolutely everything they could get their wings on. They didn't just write down dry tax receipts. They wrote the world's very first literature. Enter Gilgamesh. Supposedly 2/3 god and 1/3 bird, Gilgamesh was humanity's first superhero. He fought forest monsters, defied gods, and sought immortality. It was a blockbuster that had everything: action, intense bromance, and a deeply depressing existential crisis about the inevitability of death. But epic poetry was just a side hustle. The true, world-changing power of writing was legal and bureaucratic control. For the first time in human evolution, a promise wasn't just words blowing in the wind, it was physical, permanent, and legally binding. Getting married? Write a tablet. Buying a house? Tablet. Adopting a child or renting a very specific goat? You guessed it, tablet. And to manage millions of these contracts, you needed a central authority. The ziggurat wasn't just a place to pray to the gods. It was the ancient world's equivalent of Wall Street, Amazon, and the IRS, all rolled into one massive mud-brick mega-corporation. Because money didn't officially exist yet, the foundation of this entire economy was grain. He who controls the wheat controls the universe. Farmers would bring their surplus crops to the temple. The priests claimed they were just collecting this food as offerings for the gods. The gods apparently had very large appetites and heavily favored the priests who managed their bank accounts. This centralized temple economy was a marvel of logistics, but it created massive wealth inequality. The guys at the top lived in absolute luxury. It functioned perfectly until the secular kings decided they wanted more power than the temple priests. Human greed had fully entered the chat. Between the intense internal politics and a rapidly changing environment, the greatest empire on Earth was heading straight for a catastrophic collapse. The storm wasn't just metaphorical. The Mesopotamian environment was incredibly fragile, and human expansion was pushing it to the breaking point. As populations exploded, these megacities needed astronomical amounts of water just to survive, but rivers are notoriously bad at staying in one place. When the Euphrates naturally shifted its course, canals dried up. Suddenly, neighboring farmers were staring at the exact same miserable puddle of water. Panic set in at the highest levels. Independent city-states like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash stopped trading and started fiercely competing for resources. This desperation gave birth to yet another delightful human invention, the highly organized, professional standing army. War was no longer just a chaotic brawl in the mud. Thanks to writing and advanced math, it became a calculated, deadly logistical machine. The Sumerians invented the phalanx, a dense, terrifying military formation where soldiers interlocked their shields and spears into a single moving wall. Suddenly, individual strength didn't matter. It was all about absolute discipline, geometry, and poking the other guy from a very safe distance. They also weaponized their greatest invention. By attaching aggressive donkeys to a heavy wooden cart, they created the world's very first battle tank, the chariot. It wasn't exactly a Ferrari. It had 4 solid wood wheels and turned like a refrigerator. But to a poor farmer armed with a stick, it was absolutely terrifying. Victorious kings would erect massive stone monuments detailing their incredible, glorious triumphs, completely exaggerating their kill counts to look like demigods. Yes, along with writing, the wheel, and irrigation, the Sumerians also pioneered the proud, timeless tradition of political propaganda and fake news. But constant warfare came with a massive price tag. Cities became intensely paranoid fortresses, hiding behind increasingly thicker and thicker mud walls. To forge all those shiny bronze spears, chariots, and thick shields, they had to burn an astronomical amount of wood to keep their massive furnaces hot. They aggressively chopped down every cedar forest in sight to fuel their war machine, completely ignoring the fact that trees are rather important for keeping the soil alive. Trees don't just provide wood, their roots act like a biological glue holding the earth together. Without them, massive amounts of topsoil wash directly into the rivers. This thick, eroded mud clogged up their intricately designed irrigation canals, requiring millions of hours of grueling manual labor just to keep the water flowing. But the final nail in the coffin was an invisible killer. You see, river water isn't perfectly fresh. It contains tiny, trace amounts of dissolved salt. When they flooded their fields year after year, under the scorching Middle Eastern sun, the water evaporated into the air, but the heavy salt stayed behind. Slowly, over centuries, a toxic white crust of salt built up over the once fertile topsoil. This terrifying, quiet process is known as salinization. It essentially poisoned the earth. Seeds that once sprang to life miraculously now shriveled up and died the moment they touched the salty dirt. The scribes' clay spreadsheets showed a terrifying trend. Wheat harvests plummeted, forcing them to switch entirely to barley, a crop that can tolerate salty soil. But nature is relentless. Eventually, the salt concentration became so unbelievably toxic that even the stubborn barley refused to grow. The foundation of their entire mega-economy vanished. Those massive bank vaults full of golden grain were suddenly echoing, dusty and completely empty. And as history constantly reminds us, you are only about 3 missed meals away from total societal collapse and revolution. The strict social pyramid fractured. Hungry farmers couldn't pay taxes, the army couldn't be fed, and the divine authority of the kings completely evaporated. Without the massive coordinated labor force to constantly maintain the intricate canals, the harsh desert environment quickly took back what it had lost. The citizens had no choice. They packed up their clay tablets, abandoned humanity's first megacities, and migrated north, leaving their dead empire behind. The mighty Ziggurats, once the bustling, chaotic centers of the ancient world, were quietly swallowed by the shifting sands of time. The Sumerian Empire was dead, entirely by their own hand, but their legacy, their writing, their math, their bureaucracy, was far too deeply encoded in human history to ever disappear. Because if there's one thing we've learned from the Sumerians, it's that human progress is built entirely on sharing and preserving knowledge. And speaking of expanding your brain, we'd like to thank today's sponsor, OmniLearn, for helping us bring history to life. Unlike the ancient Ajuba schools where a teacher would literally hit you with a stick for getting a math problem wrong, OmniLearn allows you to master complex concepts in math, science and computer logic through fun, bite-sized interactive puzzles. Whether you want to understand the physics behind massive architectural structures or finally figure out base 60 mathematics, you can do it at your own pace. To start building your own empire of knowledge, be one of the first 200 people to click the link in the description for 20% off your annual subscription. Thanks again to OmniLearn. And now, let's get back to the mud. To truly appreciate how incredible this civilization was, we need to rewind the clock and look at their crowning architectural achievement. Let's examine exactly how you build a skyscraper-sized temple when your only available materials are literally dirt and water. Welcome to the site of Uruk, around 3200 BCE. Before it was a sprawling metropolis, it was just a massive, very flat, and very muddy construction site. Unlike the Egyptians, who had massive stone quarries, the Sumerians had zero stone and almost no timber. Their entire empire was built on mud. To solve this, they invented the standardized wooden brick mold. It sounds incredibly boring, but it was basically the ancient equivalent of the Lego brick. By mixing mud with straw and baking them under the brutal Mesopotamian sun, they could mass-produce an infinite supply of cheap, uniform building blocks. But without cranes or trucks, how do you move millions of bricks into the sky? You use a massive, grueling human chain of highly organized labor. This required a level of logistical coordination that would make a modern supply chain manager weep. But eventually, the great foundation was laid. With the base secured, they didn't just build a flat, boring box. They built upward in massive, receding tiers, creating a colossal stepped pyramid. Monumental, incredibly steep staircases crisscrossed the exterior, leading thousands of feet up into the sky. It was designed to be a literal stairway to heaven. At the very summit sat the Holy Temple, coated in stark white gypsum to reflect the blinding desert sun like a glowing divine beacon. This was the exclusive penthouse suite of the high priests. It was strictly VIP only, the one place where they supposedly communed directly with the gods. Around this massive central hub, the city of Uruk exploded outward, forming the ancient world's very first true urban sprawl. It was surrounded by a massive, intimidating defensive wall spanning 6 miles, protecting a bustling, chaotic maze of mud brick houses and winding canals. Walking through Uruk would feel incredibly claustrophobic. Houses were packed so tightly together that you often shared 3 walls with your neighbors. In fact, the streets were so narrow and useless that many people just used the flat, interconnected roofs of their houses as the main sidewalks. Down in the public markets, the city was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of commerce, showcasing the division of labor in full swing. Artisans mass-produced beautiful clay pottery on the newly invented potter's wheel, essentially turning cheap dirt into the ancient equivalent of Tupperware. But arguably their greatest and most beloved consumer good was beer. The Sumerians absolutely loved beer, brewing dozens of different varieties. It was so thick and chunky with bread remnants that they had to drink it through special, long reed straws just to filter out the gross bits. To keep this massive, chaotic, drunken megacity from collapsing in on itself, the king had to maintain absolute, unquestioned authority. He wasn't just a politician, he was the primary mediator between the unpredictable, terrifying forces of nature, which they called gods, and the mortal citizens. If he performed the rituals correctly, the gods would grant them another year of bountiful harvests. Uruk had reached the absolute peak of human achievement. But there was a massive catch to this golden age. Uruk had unlimited mud and grain, but practically zero timber, stone, or precious metals. To get the resources they needed to maintain their glorious temples, they had to invent something else: long-distance international trade. Enter the merchant class, ambitious, wealthy businessmen who loaded up reed boats with grain and textiles, sailing down the Persian Gulf. They traded their massive agricultural surplus for exotic goods: copper from Oman, cedar wood from Lebanon, and brilliant blue lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. But international trade meant trusting complete strangers with your valuable goods. And wherever there is money, there is fraud. To prevent tampering, the Sumerians invented a brilliant piece of security technology, the cylinder seal. Think of it as an ancient barcode. It was a small carved stone that, when rolled across wet clay on a door or a jar, left a unique, continuous and unforgeable 3D signature. Of course, where there is business, there are lawsuits. And the Sumerians were notoriously litigious. They sued each other over everything. To keep order, the kings created the first written legal codes in human history, centuries before the famous Code of Hammurabi. These legal codes operated on a surprisingly modern, almost computational logic. It was a strict system of, if X happens, then Y is the penalty. If a rented boat sinks, the renter pays for it. If your neighbor's escaped pig eats your cabbage, he owes you silver. Everything was meticulously regulated. Though their justice system could still be bizarre, sometimes guilt was determined by throwing the accused into the river. If you floated, you were innocent. This intense regulation created a society absolutely obsessed with bureaucracy. They produced millions of legal tablets, covering every conceivable human interaction. By 2500 BCE, this incredible combination of agriculture, writing, international trade, and strict law had turned Sumer into an unstoppable global superpower. But as we know from every great empire in history, the heavier and more complex a system becomes, the harder it eventually falls. The cracks in the Golden Empire weren't caused by a single catastrophic event. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. It started, predictably, with the economy. Decades of extreme salinization finally caused a total, unrecoverable agricultural collapse. The once lush green fields turned into toxic, white dust bowls. There was simply no grain left to put into the vaults. And as the food supply dried up, the intricate, highly structured social pyramid completely shattered. Desperate for survival, the unified Sumerian city-states turned on each other. The golden age of trade was replaced by brutal, endless civil war. But fighting a civil war while starving is a terrible strategy, especially when you have neighbors who have been watching you get rich for centuries. Nomadic tribes from the surrounding mountains, like the Elamites and Gutians, saw the smoke rising from the weakened megacities. They swept down into the valleys, easily breaching the massive, paranoid defensive walls that the starving Sumerians could no longer afford to man. The invaders didn't care about complex base 60 mathematics or legally binding clay contracts. They just wanted the loot. The magnificent Ziggurat megacorporations were completely sacked. Their precious records, massive libraries, and economic ledgers were smashed into dust. The wealthy elite, the kings, the priests, and the tech billionaire scribes, were either killed, enslaved, or forced to flee into the unforgiving desert. Within a shockingly short period, the greatest superpower the world had ever seen was reduced to smoldering, silent mud brick ruins. Without the constant, obsessive human labor to maintain the canals, the unpredictable rivers shifted away, leaving the cities to dry up completely. The remaining survivors abandoned their homes, leaving the empty husks of their monumental achievements to be swallowed by the harsh desert sands. For thousands of years, the Sumerians were completely forgotten. Buried under the sands of Uruk, their existence was entirely erased from human memory. It wasn't until the 19th century that curious archaeologists started digging in the desert and stumbled upon the greatest plot twist in history. When they finally decoded the bizarre wedge-shaped marks, they didn't just find a dead civilization, they found the source code of the modern world. The Sumerians didn't actually disappear. Their empire just shed its physical mud brick body and transformed into immortal, unbreakable ideas. Look at your wrist. The reason your hour has exactly 60 minutes and your minute has exactly 60 seconds is because of Sumerian base 60 math. Every time a pilot navigates using a 360-degree compass or an architect calculates the angle of a building, they are using Sumerian geometry. Look at the night sky. They were the first to divide the heavens into 12 constellations, giving us the zodiac signs millions of people still use today. When you sign a rental lease, or when a judge slams a gavel in a courtroom, you are participating in a bureaucratic tradition they invented. When you swipe a credit card, you are using their concept of abstract ledgers and debt. They essentially invented the concept of the modern economy. Even the underlying if-then logic of the computer or smartphone you are watching this video on traces its roots back to their strict legal codes. Every sprawling, chaotic concrete jungle on Earth today is just a highly upgraded, electrified version of Uruk. And what about King Gilgamesh, the hero who desperately sought immortality? He actually achieved his goal. He didn't find magic water to cure death. He achieved immortality by having his story written down, allowing him to live forever in the minds of readers. That is the true power of writing. It is a literal form of time travel. It allows ideas to survive long after the physical bodies of their creators have turned to dust. The Sumerians started as a group of hungry birds playing with mud, and completely by accident, they built the operating system for humanity. But before we blindly praise them for inventing the modern world, we have to ask a highly controversial question. Was the invention of civilization actually a massive downgrade for the average individual? For hundreds of thousands of years, hunter-gatherers worked maybe 15 hours a week to survive. They had incredibly diverse diets and abundant free time. Then agriculture happened. Suddenly, birds were doing back-breaking manual labor from sunrise to sunset, completely destroying their joints in the process. Their incredible diverse diet shrank to almost exclusively wheat and barley, leading to widespread malnutrition and terrible dental health. Living tightly packed with tens of thousands of others, and their farm animals, created the perfect breeding ground for brand new infectious diseases. And then there was the invention of extreme inequality. For the first time, a few individuals hoarded wealth while the masses starved. In a hunter-gatherer tribe, you shared everything. In civilization, a guy with a clay tablet showed up to legally take half your stuff. Not to mention the invention of professional, industrialized warfare, which made dying violently vastly more efficient than ever before. Because of this, many modern anthropologists argue that the agricultural revolution was actually history's biggest, most elaborate trap. Once you started farming, the population boomed. You couldn't just go back to picking berries because there were too many mouths to feed. The trap snapped shut. You couldn't just walk away. Outside the walls were hostile nomads waiting to kill you. Inside, you were a slave to the temple bureaucracy. It is the ultimate paradox of human history. Was all this suffering worth it to get to where we are today? We got mathematics, astronomy, and modern technology, but the foundation was paid for entirely with the sweat and broken bones of the working class. And looking around at our own incredibly complex, stressful, and deeply unequal modern world, you really have to wonder, or have things changed that much? The truth is, whether it's worth it or not, doesn't really matter. Because humanity is locked into a massive, unstoppable cycle. Sumer, Egypt, Rome, the Maya, every single great civilization in history has followed the exact same trajectory: explosive rise, absolute peak, and inevitable collapse. But a collapse is never the end of the story. It's just a harsh, systemic reset, like a forest fire clearing out the dead wood to make room for new growth. When the massive, top-heavy bureaucracies fall apart, the resilient individuals survive, carrying the most important tool with them: knowledge. The surviving Sumerians passed their math and writing to the Babylonians, who passed it to the Greeks, then the Romans, all the way down the line to us. Which brings us to a very uncomfortable realization about our current, highly advanced global superpower. The historical cracks are starting to show again. We are facing the exact same environmental and social pressures that destroyed Uruk, just on a much more terrifying, planetary scale. We are exploiting our resources faster than they can naturally recover. Our metaphorical salt is slowly poisoning the global soil, oceans, and atmosphere. But there is one massive, crucial difference between us and the ancient Sumerians. A difference that might just save us. We have something they didn't: hindsight. We have thousands of years of recorded history telling us exactly what happens if we ignore the warning signs. Thanks to the very writing system they invented, we don't have to guess what causes an empire to collapse. We have the data, and we can predict the outcomes. We are the first civilization in the history of the planet with the technological capability to actually see the cliff approaching and physically steer away from it. We are standing at the exact same crossroads they did. We can either stubbornly stick to the path of self-destruction, or we can use our collective knowledge to adapt, evolve, and build something completely sustainable. The cycle doesn't have to end in dust. The Sumerians laid the foundation in the mud. Now, it's entirely up to us to decide what kind of ruins we are going to leave behind for the next civilization. So the next time you check your watch to see how many minutes are left in your day, or complain on the internet about a terrible customer service experience, just remember that you are actively participating in a 5,000-year-old human tradition. The Sumerians may have physically faded into the dust of Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, but as long as we keep observing the stars, doing the math, and writing things down, their enigmatic spirit will live on forever. If you want to keep exploring the incredible, chaotic, and sometimes ridiculous history of human civilization, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Creating these deep dive animations takes thousands of hours of research, drawing, and animating by our incredibly dedicated team. If you want to support us directly and get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access, and beautiful wallpapers, Consider joining our Patreon or grabbing some exclusive, high-quality merch from our online store, like this very historically accurate cat plushie. A massive thank you to all our current supporters who make these videos possible. We literally couldn't do it without you. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.